Welcome to the Healthy Perspective Podcast with your host, chiropractor, entrepreneur, mentor, and author, Dr. Chris Bowman. He'll break down and extract the secret sauce behind his own success and the success of some of the top leaders in every category and from around the world. Get ready for your weekly mental adjustment because shift is going to happen.
Everyone, welcome to another episode of the Healthy Perspective Podcast. My name is Dr. Chris Bowman, and today we have with us Rich Levene, who founded Dignity Leadership Consulting. Rich is a master's in leadership and change from St. Edward's University in Austin, Texas, and he spent 25 years studying how people work together or don't. Rich thinks big and solves problems creatively while remaining objective and realistic. His first book, You're Doing It Wrong, Stop Managing and Start Leading, hit booksellers' shelves in June 2022. I am so thankful to have another coach on. I've been talking to a lot of doctors and entrepreneurs in different spaces, and it's always fun for me to get back to the coaching and consulting because there's just so much cohesiveness, so much like-mindedness, and so it fires me up. So this is almost a selfish conversation that I'm having this morning, and I'm glad everyone else gets to listen. Rich, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks for the invite. I appreciate being here.
Of course. So leadership training, obviously something that our country lacks, something that a lot of businesses lacks. How did you get interested in, becoming a better leader, pushing yourself through school to make that happen?
I think it's part of we'll call it my Hollywood hero story. Mm-hmm. And I was always on the management side. I'm a task-oriented person, and I was good at getting things done. I was good at processes, procedures, maybe the profitability statement, all those weird P's. And I was working with my team, and we were hitting our sales numbers, and we were doing well, but we just felt like there was something more. And I kept asking my team, I'm like, if I keep doing what I'm doing, and you don't give me any feedback, nothing's going to change. I said, something's got to change. And finally, one of them was brave enough to come in and give me some feedback. And I said, we really don't think you care about people. We just think you care about profitability, processes, products, and what I call the bad P's. And I'm like, you know what? It was an aha moment. And I discovered in that moment that despite the fact that we were hitting all the numbers and the metrics, that really wasn't what was engaging people and making them happy. So I decided I had to change internally. It couldn't be something I could force upon something else. So that's where I started, is you got to change with yourself.
That's so good. And I've seen all too many managers, business owners, employees alike point the finger at other people saying, I can't be successful because you blah, 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 playing really the victim mentality instead of the victor mentality, How do you go about influencing those sort of people that think the problem is always elsewhere, or do you just let them go? I'm just kidding.
That's interesting. So, there is a dynamic at some point, if we finish where you started, where you do have to let them go. But you've got to start understanding people, and you've got to meet them where they are. And that's starting to understand some of the behaviors. What makes them tick? What are their motivators? And once you start identifying how people like to be treated and how they like to act, then I can try to meet them, like I said earlier, where they are, and now we can start going somewhere. And then within that, there's a curve in there, and I forget the actual name of the curve, but the first 10 to 20% of the people are going to probably likely buy in just because that's the way they are with whatever you're doing. Then you got to get them and you work together to try to convince everybody else to buy in what you're doing. And then once you get to the end, you're going to have a handful of people that just simply aren't ever going to agree with what you're trying to do or where you're trying to go. And that's when you got to make that difficult decision. Do you keep them or do you move on?
That's so hard, and especially the new business owner, that's what scares a lot of people. I have a lot of service professionals, that I work with that are just the single one-man show, one-woman show, no employees or anything like that. And it's that fear of hiring people, changing the energy, changing the dynamic. What do I look for? Those sort of things. So as a leader, obviously your goal isn't to bring on a company of leaders. Obviously, you can train people up and promote them. What do you look for when making that new hire as a leader, looking for like to better your company? And let's say we can take it a couple different ways. Let's say you're looking for mainly a laborer type person, like there's specific tasks, specific goals, not necessarily high educated, necessary. Moving to manager, moving to executive, what are the key things, or are there similarities that you're looking for when you're looking to hire in these positions?
What I always try to look for is the character side or the attitude side. Does somebody have a willingness to help other people? Do they have a
Mm,
willingness to learn? And are they going to grow in some capacity? Because
mm,
as people, you don't want somebody just to come in and just be the same,
yeah.
start to finish all the way through. And that's when it really gets frustrating, because as as your business grows, or as you grow as an individual, as your team grows, if you have somebody in your team that's not willing to continue that growth journey with you, that's what starts to pull the other team down. And then you start having
Mm,
this conflict starts going up, and everybody, I just want it the same. Well, unfortunately, not everything in this world stays the same. So the first thing I look for is that willingness to learn, and having an attitude, having a can-do attitude, and believing in themselves.
mm-hmm,
They don't believe in themselves, how are they going to believe in what I'm doing?
mm-hmm. That's good. You wrote a book. How was that process? What can you tell us? What are the key points in there?
So I did. I wrote a book, and it was based on the model I developed for my master's program. But the process of writing a book was pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I had some free time on my hands. I was, as I was building my practice, so I just sat down and I focused, and I set aside. It took me 6 weeks to write the book. People tell me I'm crazy,
Mm-hmm.
but I literally sat aside before Christmas 10 to 12 hours a day. Some days I
Wow.
spent 14, 15 hours, and I went through it. I had an outline. I wrote it. I worked through all the things. But in the book, what I talk about is, I marry up real life experiences that I had, aha moments where I was probably the manager, the jerk, if you will, that
Mm,
didn't do things to the best of the people's abilities. I did it to
mm-hmm.
the best of the process abilities, or those P's we were talking about earlier. So I wrote about that and said, okay, here's what happened. Here's what I did. Here's what I learned from it. And then I took that and I started applying some of the values of what I believe in through leadership. And then I wrote about those and why I believe they work. But the underlying principle of the book is, one is you got to start with yourself.
Mm,
And then two, you got to help other people. But three is, leadership is so different for everybody. And if you pick up my book and you read it and you think you're going to understand leadership, I even beg you in the book, I said, please don't do this, because that's not going to work.
mm,
I read a lot of books, and I encourage other people to read books and to learn as much as you possibly can from other people. And then what you need to do is, what I believe you need to do is find concepts, find things that work for you, find different things that other people have done, and then figure out how to take that internally and process it and turn it into something that works for you. And the end product is you've got this hybrid model of a bunch of other people's ideas
yeah.
that you've spun and made your own. And now you're being authentic, because I mean, there's so many ideas out there, and we can try to create new ideas. But I had a prof tell me in my master's program, is like, everything's already been thought of once or twice somewhere. So you're not going to come up with any new ideas. There's just too much information in the world right now with the internet.
Yeah. And it's a blessing and a curse, right? You can go and look up anything that you want to. Facts are becoming less important to memorize. But at the same time, I mean, choices are hard. If you have one or two choices, you'll make it pretty quickly. But you start talking about 5, 10, 15 choices, and new ones coming up, it seems like every day. There's a lot to choose from. It can get overwhelming. Um, Kind of speaking of choices, I'm sure that you chose your name either because of a past hurt or because you see what's kind of going on in the. Why don't you help us just kind of walk us through leadership consulting and just give us an understanding of why this name and what you can get out of that experience.
Well, it starts with, so number one, I identified what my values were, and I
It's
think
good.
that's what you need. You're talking about choices. So once you understand your values and what's important to you and your purpose, your vision, now you can start making better decisions. Do these choices align? And in that process, when I was writing a paper, working on my thesis, basically on what's the difference between being a manager and being a leader, because I really didn't know when I went into this,
Mm-hmm.
and that term is used so instantly. But I discovered work by Donna Hicks, who has a PhD from Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that she said is, a common denominator amongst all people anywhere in the world, regardless of where you're at, what you believe, how you're raised, any of those things, is people just want to be treated with respect.
Mm.
And she defined that as dignity. And I'm like, you know what? That really speaks to me, because if you help people get what they want, they in return will help you get what you want. And she's gone on to do a bunch of work with the U.S. government in some negotiations. She's written a couple books. So I've been following her work, and I'm like, you know what? I really kind of like that concept. So that goes back to
Yeah.
what I said earlier. You read a lot of things and you find what speaks to you. That was one
Yeah.
of the pieces that spoke to me. There's a lot of other authors that have spoke to
Right.
me, and I've developed some of those things. But that's where dignity leadership comes in. And then the value side. I was sitting in class one day, and we were walking through an exercise, and this was just the final aha moment. It wasn't, change happens over time. It's a process, not an event. But
Right.
the event that like did it for me is we were doing this exercise, and I came up with my own personal why statement. It's to learn, to grow, to lead, and create a world of dignity. But what that did is it tied in. I had to document a couple things that I wanted to work on in the very first couple of weeks of my master's class. And one of them, I said, I want to be a better listener, because I think I stink at listening.
Mm.
And I think it's a critical skill. The other
Yeah.
one is critical thinking. Well, in order to give dignity, I now have to do both things. I have to listen to the other person and
Right.
hear what they're saying. And then I've got to be able to think critically about what they're saying and say, okay, what are the possibilities that lie within this statement or whatever this person's telling me, instead of just going and saying, that's wrong. And that's kind of why I wrote my title of my book is You're Doing It Wrong, because that's kind of how I grew up in an environment with a lot of rules, private schools, it's this way or that way, and there was no in between, a lot of conservative stuff. And so to be able to bring that in and open my mind, it was eye-opening for me. And I mean, humbling myself, I had no idea what critical thinking was when I went into my master's program. I just thought it was how you attack somebody. And that's
Right.
not what you do. That is totally wrong.
Right. And that brings up such a good point, because our childhood does frame how we, view our future. And if all our childhood was rules, this and that, and the other, you're either doing it right or doing it wrong. I mean, there's how else are you supposed to manage people? You're either doing it right or you're doing it wrong. And there are boundaries, but how did you go about rewiring your brain to kind of push beyond the binary thinking? And I think that's what's really that scarcity model, that fear model, is either you're doing it right or you're doing it wrong. And there's this whole gray area in between of, like, hey, based on my perspective, I thought I was doing things right, but I wasn't aligned with what you wanted. So therefore, to you, it looked like I was doing things wrong. How are you able to approach that and reprogram that? Because I don't think you're alone.
Well, number one, you've got to be willing to learn and willing to grow. I made an internal decision that what I was doing wasn't giving me the results I wanted.
Hmm.
And you can't go change everybody else. So and I kind of looked at and analyzed a lot of things. And I'm an analyst, by human nature. I love numbers and dissecting and data. So I started looking at all things, and I said, what is the common thread with why things aren't turning out the way I want them to?
Mm-hmm.
It was me. I was the common denominator. I was involved in every one of those. And that takes self-awareness.
Yeah.
And then once I started identifying self-awareness of what was important to me, what's not important to me, and then the second piece of that is how does that affect other people? If I'm doing these things and I'm not getting what I want, obviously it can't be everybody else in the world. It's got to be me. And I think that's where a lot of people struggle, is they think the world's just going to adapt to them. But it's really not adapting to them. You've got to adapt to the environment.
Right. And that's a huge concept too, adaptability, being a chiropractor. It's what I talk about day in and day out. Like, if you're stressed and overwhelmed, one little thing is gonna, you know, game. Like, you gotta be adaptable. So how do you teach people? I'm sure you've got plenty of people who are, stressed, to overwhelm, maybe have made good money but aren't living the life of their dreams. What are some of the exercises that you would take, me through if I'm coming and say, hey, Rich, I know I need something, I need a mentor. I'm not living the life that I want to live. What are some of the first things that you would take somebody through?
One of the first things I like to do is I come from the behavioral science side. So I ask them if they're willing to run through, and I use the DISC profile, and ask them if they're willing to do a DISC assessment. And the one I use is very powerful. It's very accurate. But the issue with that is it's going to pull up a image of you, and an image of you that you probably haven't seen, because we all walk through the world with our ego on our shoulders saying, hey, here I am, I'm exactly what the world needs. And in reality, that's not what everybody else is seeing. So if somebody's willing to step back and say, okay, we need to start building your self-awareness.
Yeah.
We need to figure out who you are. And then what we do with that self-awareness is we start identifying your strengths. And then we start working with you on what you're good at instead of trying to fix what you're not good at. Now, we're going to also identify, I call them opportunities, because that stays on the positive spectrum.
Right.
And what are those opportunities? That's areas where we can do better with what we have, so that we don't maybe rub people the wrong way, or maybe, turn somebody off, make them feel bad, or do like I did in the title of my book and say, you're doing it wrong. Nobody wants to hear that, because a negative thought sticks in the brain 2 times as long as a positive thought.
Wow.
And so you've got to run through some exercises mentally to get out of that negative mindset.
Right.
If you are in, I'm not saying anybody's in that negative mindset, but we got to do some exercises to make sure you stay out of it.
Yeah. And it's such an important point to bring up, because any sort of negative comment is going to trigger the amygdala, which is a fear, fight or flight center, and that person is going to become reactive.
Yep.
Trying to then coach a reactive person, anything that you say that's not aligned with what they want, you're going to be seen as and that's where these relationships just start, mashing heads and joining as one.
Yeah, I think right there is you just hit it. So if you're a manager and you haven't, let's just say you're a new manager and you haven't learned leadership skills yet. And leadership is something that can be learned. Only 10% of the world's population is a natural born leader.
Well,
I even compare it to like athletes. Like some of the world's class athletes still need a coach to set a world record. Most of them understand they can't do it on their own. But it's just that growth cycle. And if you're that manager and you're telling somebody they're doing it wrong, it's like, wait a minute. Once you put them in fight or flight, the other person's brain becomes hijacked. It's hyper-focused. They get defensive, and then everything just brews and it boils over and it turns into an ugly mess. And that's where that critical thinking and self-awareness comes in, which builds empathy.
Manager, as a leader, even if there's something that needs to be corrected, how you correct it can really influence that relationship. And had a manager once, we worked great when it was just her and I, but as we started hiring more and more people, I was starting to see friction with the way that she was training the other employees, and it was almost with the iron rod, like you would a kid, where you do something as this now that you're going to do something wrong again, which further, the energy in the practice was different, because my style of leadership is like, hey, so why'd you do things like that? Either I forgot, either I this and that and the other thing. Okay, well, here's what systems, what things can I do to empower you to not forget again, or so they left corrected feeling like I can do better, rather than I hope I don't fail again. And that's an important thing, and that's where I'm sure you align people's vision with. If you're focusing on, if you're focusing on the target, you're most likely gonna focusing on not missing the target. Then you're probably gonna miss, because you're still focusing on missing. What are some resources that you tend to give managers or people looking to become better leaders that are going through your program?
A couple things we do is we sit down and we work on identifying values based on their values, not somebody else's values. So to find out what's important with them. There's a couple really easy exercises. You can go out, you can find it on the web, and just download what I tell everybody is, hey, here's a value sheet. Let's just say there's 100 different values on here. It doesn't mean it's not an exclusive list, obviously. It can be inclusive. But go through, and what I have them do is, I need you to circle 10, 15, 20 of these. And then what we do is we start saying, okay, why did you circle those? And we start talking through all those. And then we say, okay, now I need you to go make your list, cut it in half, and really start making them focus on what's important to them. And then we get, let's say there was 20 on their list, now they're down to 10. I do it one more time, say, all right, we got to get this down to 5 or less. And then you're really identifying, and that helps you, goes back to what we talked about earlier with making those decisions. If these values are really important to me, that's going to help you guide your decision-making process. And then if you can elaborate that or communicate that with whoever you're working with, if you're a manager and you're communicating to your employees, now there's something binding that decision process together versus you just saying no to something all the time,
Right.
or helping them understand why you said yes. And that was a piece that I try to work with, is understanding and breaking down for people is why things worked, because a lot of us understand why they don't work.
Right.
I mean, if you have a bad experience, it just sticks with you. It's like, oh, dang, that didn't work.
Right.
Um, and when it does work, it's like, wow, that was pretty awesome. And then you try to replicate it and it doesn't work. You don't know why.
Right.
And I've discovered a lot of that comes from, these values, or, your behaviorals, what's driving. And then the other thing is your motivations. I also do an assessment with them. I combine it with the DISC. I marry it together. And it identifies what motivates people. And there's, so once you identify the core behaviors of somebody, you can't say that person's just like another person.
Right.
Because once you start getting into motivated, they might have the same behavioral preferences,
Yeah.
but what motivates them could be completely different.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that's when the aha moment comes on.
Right. Yeah, because I've had them cash bonus and like, cool, here's the time off. I'm like, oh my gosh, thank you so much. Like being individual with the way that, what actually motivates them is huge. And you have some courses and even some free things available on your website. Why don't you walk people through if people want to learn a little bit more about you, or, kind of just take the next step, dabble in, maybe this leadership stuff is new. Maybe they're a manager thinking like, man, I thought the title made me a leader. I didn't know there. What are some first steps that they can take that are free and easy?
So if you go out to our website, it's dignity-leadership.com. And you can click on, there's a tab on there that says free stuff. And there's also a couple different other landing pages. We've got what we call our Leadership Mind Sprint course, which is a 12-week course that we run you through different exercises. We take online learning, traditional learning, some reading, and some one-on-one coaching, and we blend it all together. And in 12 weeks, we help you develop your leadership skills. And there's a cost with that one. But on the free side is you can get into our LMS. It's called the Dignity Leadership Learning Laboratory.
Mm-hmm.
And in that laboratory, we have 3 courses that are free that'll help you. Probably the most popular one is the one called Management versus Leadership. So it explains, it walks through in about 10 minutes the high-level differences between those. We've got a podcast. It's also on the website, so people can get free content there. And we also have a free DISC assessment. So the scientific DISC assessment we do is definitely comes with a cost, because there's a lot of research that's gone into that. But we have a free one out there that's non-scientific, just based on how you answer questions. It's 8 questions, and then we give you the answers, and you can run through and kind of help you identify some of your preferences. But with only 8 questions, you can actually game that one pretty easy if you wanted to, and say, well, I want to be like this today. So
I see.
yeah, with the scientific one, you can't do that, because it's really got it built. It's pretty amazing how it works.
Yeah. So if I was gonna come away with one, the essential to being a leader is, first of all, knowing yourself. You can't
Absolutely.
lead without knowing your values. You can't lead without knowing your strengths and your weaknesses. You can't lead without knowing where you want to go and the vision. Everybody. Now, so many people want to step into the leadership role, and then they really push their problems on other people because they haven't gone through there. So I love that you take the time not just to in a sense get the results, like make higher money, develop better systems. Like those things will come when you have the strong foundation of knowing yourself and actually figuring out what's valuable to you. And it could save people a ton of money in either buying things that don't mean anything to you. Buy the Lamborghini and you're like, wait a minute, this means nothing to me. Or ignorance tax, doing things wrong for so many years, figuring out that you could have done things right. And I think one thing that you would agree with as well, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, knowing yourself is a continual process as you continue to grow. I'm a different person to married, to 1 kid, to 2 kids, to 3 kids, to this business, to that business. And so a continual process of knowing yourself and watching how you change. Change isn't a bad thing. If you're changing, it's a good thing. It means that you're growing. But if you go off your 50-year-old values, making decisions as a 30-year-old with the same thing as a 45-year-old, I a driver's license, it's still my 16-year-old picture, and I'm 32 years old now, and I'm like, I'm just gonna see how long I can take it. I'm gonna be old and gray with my 16-year-old picture. But if I make decisions that person, going to continue to feel like 16-year-old self. I'm going to keep on getting jobs at this and that and the other thing. I'm never going to excel. So I think that's huge. Plenty of there's a book. Gosh, I can't remember. I'll put it in the show notes. But it's that you can it's like a 2-day retreat. You buy a book, you go off to yourself, off in the mountains, or if you don't have mountains, somewhere nice, and you just work through yourself, dive through yourself, and so I think Rich has some really powerful things to say, and I'm really thankful for you.
Hey, I thank you for the time today. It's been enjoyable conversation. And
Good.
growing's part of life. We all have to do it.
Right. Yep. And it could be fun if it's growing because you want to, not growing because you're reacting to bad circumstances in your life. So be proactive with your life. Learn to grow as early as you can. And unfortunately, I feel like that's what's changed maybe in the schools a little bit, where schools have become more about rules than they have about growing. And not every school, and not everything's going to be perfect, but with the standardized testing and with this and that and the other thing, it's really reinforcing you are this person, you need to be this to be right, and if you aren't, it's your fault, not my fault.
Yeah, and I've talked about that in the past with schools, and so much of what schools will do is they take the opposite of finding strengths. They find what you're not good at. So if you're a student, when does mom and dad get a call at home? When you didn't do well, right? Yeah. They don't pick up the phone and call and say, hey, you know what? Chris was in class today and he's on his math test, he hit 100%. No, they call and say, yeah, Chris was in spelling today and he's bombing his spelling. And then what do? All they do is they focus on what you're not doing well, and they're trying to fix that. And that's where I think a lot of this mindset comes in. I think it's where I got trapped is everything was always going on. I had good report cards as a kid, but what did everybody focus on? If I didn't get an A, it was that B or C I got on my report card. And so I did finally get a D, and it was in college, and it was because I got lost and I didn't know where to go, and I didn't stay disciplined. Let's put it that way for the first semester. But then I got back on track. But and at that point in time, at least I was at a private university, and they understood what was going on. They're like, hey, we got to write the course. And they helped me get back on track. But so many times these teachers, and I'm not going to blame the teachers because I think the teachers are trying their best.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
The system, and the system, and what it's teaching us is it's to fix everybody's weaknesses. If you lead with strengths and you identify what somebody has that's good that can help your team, you can start making a powerful team. And I'm coaching these people, and they come up and they say, well, and I teach them how to identify other behaviors in people. So one, I teach them how to identify themselves, and they say, okay, now what do you think your boss is, or who this person you're having conflict is? What's going on? And they start identifying. They go, well, I don't think it's really good because they're not like me. And I said, no, that is why I think this is going to work. Let's take what they have. Let's apply their strengths to where you're weak, and now we marry them up. Now, if you have 4 people on your team and everybody has 4 different strengths, now you've got something powerful, something you can go and you can conquer, and you can do all these great things by helping each other out. And, it just makes life so much easier when you look at strengths versus looking at weaknesses.
Yep, that's so good. That's so important to keep in mind too as you start hiring people. If you look at a team and the team all looks the same, you're not going anywhere. You're just
you start breaking down critical thinking skills. If everybody starts thinking alike for too long, even if you bring together, so the dynamics of the team can change, and as they change, maybe they come the same. And if everybody continues to keep thinking the same way, then you're not going to have any innovation. You're not going to have any creativity unless you're actually conscious of that, and you're forcing it with your team to say, hey, look, we're falling back in the same ruts. Because if everybody's doing the same thing and you're doing the same thing over and over again, we all know that's the definition of insanity. Nothing's ever going to change.
Right. Yep. And change is what we need. Well, Richard, you've already listed your website. What if you could, impart some wisdom on somebody? Let's say you don't know if you're ever going to see them again. What would you want them to know?
Wow. I would say never stop learning. Always be a continuous learner. If you're willing to have an open mind and continue to learn, you're going to go places.
It's good. I agree 100%. Someone can take that into any walk of life and continue to get better day in and day out if they're just willing to look at their circumstances, not in how it's affecting them, but how can they grow and learn and make impact. I was watching last night called Alone, and one of the guys was saying while he was hunting, he said, your level of awareness has to be bigger than your level of disturbance. And I was like, man, like that just speaks. Obviously, hunting, you want to be aware of what's going on around you. And just in life, of your what's going on around you more than the impact that you're making. I mean, I think it's huge. So with that, we'll go ahead and close for today. I think we should definitely schedule. There's a lot more to be said for sure. I really appreciate you. If you have the opportunity, go listen to Rich's podcast. Go check out his book. Let's give him some support, and looking forward to seeing where the world takes you and how we can continue to be a better place together.
Thank you for listening to the Healthy Perspective Podcast. To connect with Dr. Bowman, follow him on Instagram at Dr. Chris Bowman. Until next time, make shift happen.